Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dominique Mendiola, and I'm the Deputy Director of Policy, Licensing, and Communications at the Marijuana Enforcement Division. Today's webinar, Understanding House Bill 19-1090, Publicly Licensed Marijuana Companies, Rules and Real-World Examples, is intended to assist our local licensing partners in understanding the state rules implementing House Bill 1090 and what to expect when processing applications from licensees. The Marijuana Enforcement Division is excited to co-host this webinar with the Colorado Municipal League and is pleased to be joined by Ross from the Colorado Attorney General's Office, T from the City of Fort Collins, and Abby from the Green Solution. Today, we'll start out with the state providing an overview of House Bill 1090. We'll highlight some important aspects of the rules that may be useful to local licensing authorities. Then T will walk us through the Fort Collins experience and provide tips, tricks, and things to keep in mind intended to help locals successfully navigate the 1090 application process. And we'll wrap up with Abby providing us with the industry perspective, including what has worked well so far and what could be improved. Before we jump into the presentation, it's important to note that none of the information we are presenting constitutes legal advice. Now let's begin by providing an overview of House Bill 1090. House Bill 1090 establishes an ownership and investment framework for Colorado marijuana businesses that allows the division to focus its licensing resources on those who control the business by applying application and approval requirements to those parties and by creating exemptions for parties considered passive owners or indirect financial interest holders, which my colleague Ross will elaborate on further. Where House Bill 1090 expands the scope of persons or entities that can own or invest in a regulated marijuana business, it defines the scope by looking to areas where there is other regulatory oversight or enhanced transparency through reporting requirements to the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission, for example. With that framing, I'm going to hand it over to Ross to expand on the basics of House Bill 1090.
Thanks, Dominique. This is Ross Hoogerheide. I'm an Attorney General with the Colorado Attorney General's Office here representing the Marijuana Enforcement Division today to talk a little bit more about House Bill 1090. So, high-level overview, House Bill 1090 creates new ownership and investment terms and allows both publicly traded corporations to own marijuana businesses as well as certain private equity funds, which are defined as qualified private funds. Both of these investments and ownership were previously prohibited under statute. Additionally, House Bill 1090 amends ownership and investment disclosure and suitability requirements. And as Dominique mentioned, importantly, House Bill 1090 incorporates federal securities terms. Where these terms may appear to be complex and confusing at first glance, the intent in relying on existing federal securities terms was to avoid the Marijuana Enforcement Division and, by extension, local licensing jurisdictions from becoming a shadow securities enforcement regulator. Instead, the intent of House Bill 1090 is that securities regulatory functions will be handled by either the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, the Colorado State Securities Division, or a federal counterpart in a permitted foreign country. It's also important to note that House Bill 1090 provided specific rulemaking authority to the Marijuana Enforcement Division. One of those areas of rulemaking included exemptions to requirements for suitability and change of owner applications. Finally, the bill included a safety clause making it effective upon signature and provided that it applied to applications on and after November 1st, 2019. Great. So getting into the specifics of the new ownership terminology adopted in House Bill 1090, the bill created two new categories of owners and one new category of contract counterparties and legacy interests that existed under prior statutes. Owners are now defined as either a controlling beneficial owner or a passive beneficial owner. A controlling beneficial owner is anyone who controls a regulated marijuana business or owns more than 10% of the owner's interest or securities in a regulated marijuana business, or is an executive officer or a member of the board of directors, regardless of stock or owner's interest percentage ownership. A passive beneficial owner, by contrast, does not control a regulated marijuana business and does not own 10% or more of the owner's interest or securities. It's important to note that both controlling beneficial owners and passive beneficial owners can be a natural person or an entity. This is a significant change from prior law where the focus was on only natural persons. It's also important to note that the terms controlling beneficial owner, passive beneficial owner, and indirect financial interest owner apply equally to publicly traded corporations and privately held regulated marijuana businesses. Finally, indirect financial interest holders is a new defined term that captures contract counterparties, including landlords and lenders, for example, as well as legacy terms that existed under prior statute, permitted economic interest that have not been converted to ownership prior to January 1st, 2019, and commercially reasonable royalty interest holders, which existed under prior statute, are all defined as indirect financial interest holders.
Now let's discuss suitability. Under House Bill 1090, any person intending to become a controlling beneficial owner of a regulated marijuana business is required to be found suitable by the state licensing authority. The scope of the state suitability review includes 3 categories: criminal character or record, licensing character or record, and financial character or record. For criminal character or record, the division conducts a fingerprint criminal history record check to verify the person has not been sentenced to a felony in the preceding 3 years. For licensing character or record, the division will review any Colorado Department of Revenue licenses held in the prior 3 years, any licenses issued by the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies held in the prior 3 years, any marijuana business from any other state, territory, District of Columbia, or other country, and any civil lawsuit that includes allegations regarding a marijuana business. For financial character or record, the division will review sanctions, penalties, assessments, or cease and desist orders imposed by any securities regulator, and 180 days of bank account statements of any controlling beneficial owner investing in the marijuana business. The new 2-200 series rules describe suitability application requirements. Now let's touch on the order of application submission when suitability is involved. For new business applications, all proposed controlling beneficial owners must be found suitable before submitting any new business application. When a proposed controlling beneficial owner has been found suitable, the division will notify relevant local licensing jurisdictions. And in an effort to minimize duplication of efforts by applicants and regulators, the division is establishing a process by which the request for suitability and information required to be submitted with any suitability request will be made available to the relevant local jurisdictions to facilitate their licensing review and approval process. For a change of ownership, the suitability request and change of ownership application can be submitted together. This does not prohibit the submission of suitability requests prior to the change of owner application. However, at the time of the submission of a change of owner application, all required suitability requests must have been previously submitted or must be submitted with the change of owner application. Upon completion of the division's investigation on a change of owner application, the division will issue a contingent approval letter to the parties. However, the state will not issue a new state license reflecting the new ownership until it receives additional information. If local approval for the change of ownership is required, proposed controlling beneficial owners must provide information demonstrating that local approval has been obtained, for example, an approval letter issued by the local jurisdiction, and must notify the state of the closing date for the change of ownership. This date must be within 365 days of the issuance of the division's contingent approval letter. If local approval is not required, the proposed controlling beneficial owners must provide information demonstrating that local approval isn't required and must notify the state of the closing date for the change of ownership. This date, again, must be within 365 days of the issuance of the division's contingent approval letter.
Importantly, the rules also include exemptions to both the suitability requirement and the change of owner application requirement. It's important to note that these exemptions are separate. So the only suitability exemption applies for a person who possesses an owner license that has not been suspended or revoked in the preceding 365 days. This is the only exemption for suitability. All other persons seeking to become a controlling beneficial owner in a regulated marijuana business must submit a request and obtain a finding of suitability from the Marijuana Enforcement Division. In contrast, the exemptions to the change of owner application requirement are numerous. The first exemption actually includes two exemptions which exempt a regulated marijuana business from submitting a change of owner application where it's changing its entity type or its entity jurisdiction. So, for example, an entity could change from a Colorado LLC to a Colorado corporation, or from a Colorado corporation to a Delaware corporation. Both of these changes would be within the exemption for entity and jurisdiction changes. However, this exemption requires that there not be any new natural person or entity controlling beneficial owners. If there are even one new controlling beneficial owner, including an entity controlling beneficial owner, a change of owner application is likely required. The next exemption to a change of owner application is where existing controlling beneficial owners are reallocating their ownership percentages. This example could apply where there are 4 owners of a regulated marijuana business, each holding 25% of the existing owner's interest of the marijuana business, and one owner would like to transfer 5% of their owner's interest to another existing owner. In that circumstance, a change of owner application would not be required to the Marijuana Enforcement Division. There are 2 exemptions for passive beneficial owners from the change of owner application requirement. The first applies where the passive beneficial owner was licensed by the Marijuana Enforcement Division prior to August 1, 2019, and the second exemption applies where the passive beneficial owner will remain a passive beneficial owner after acquiring the owner's interest or securities in the regulated marijuana business. Finally, executive officers and members of the board of directors are exempt from a change of owner application. It's important to note, however, that these individuals are not exempt from a suitability application. That suitability application is required 45 days after the person becomes an executive officer or a member of the board of directors. Finally, with all of the exemptions to the change of owner application, there is still a notification and a fee required that must be submitted to the Marijuana Enforcement Division. Dominique, anything else you want to add on the exemptions?
No, I think we are ready to transition to T, who will walk us through the Fort Collins experience right now.
Thank you, Dominique and Ross. Thank you, Dominique and Ross, for the overview of 1090. My name's Talisha, and T's my nickname, and I'm with the City of Fort Collins. And today I'm here to discuss the experience that Fort Collins has to date about this new process with 1090. I'll just point out it's been really short, this process, because today's date is December 19th, 2019, and emergency rules went into effect on 1090 on November 1st, 2019. So all of us here speaking on this webinar are still learning as we go, so just bear with us that we're giving our best information to date. I'm going to give you an overview. I have this slide that's a triangle to kind of give a background for my colleagues more in the local government to truly understand about an application process. So If you're not aware, the marijuana applicant, and sitting next to me is Abby with the Green Solution, it's their responsibility to submit 2 applications, and it's dual licensing. We're a dual licensing state, so they're going to submit one to the Marijuana Enforcement Division and then one to the local municipality. Dominique and Ross spoke about this. This happens simultaneously, and you can kind of see in the triangle that the reason why I did arrows going back and forth is there's communication that is going on between all 3 parties. And I wrote in the middle about transparency because we have to be transparent, and there's an exchange of information that's going on. On the bottom of the triangle, you'll note it's definitely between the Marijuana Enforcement Division and local government. There's complexities of regulation rules, and we all need to follow the Colorado statutes and all the rules that are in place. But it's also the responsibility of the marijuana applicant to understand those rules, and they have a difficult timeline to follow at the pace that the Marijuana Enforcement Division is going to process their application, and then they also have to follow the timeline of the local government to have that application processed. Would you agree?
This is Abby Forchers with the Green Solution. To give some context, we've been working closely with T on our transaction and have found Fort Collins' process to be really fantastic and working with us and figuring out how to do this together. So yeah, I would agree with everything that you just said.
So I'm going to go to the next slide, which actually just gives tips and tricks, and just to kind of give some more background information. The Green Solution has an excellent relationship with the Marijuana Enforcement Division as well as the City of Fort Collins, and they let us know right from the get-go that we're planning to submit this application. And just a big tip is you want to have that relationship with your applicant from the beginning, because then you're prepared, and then you can go on in your municipality behind the scenes just to make sure that your local code is up to speed or it's current and active, and then you're constantly talking to your team to make sure everything is in place. So we had one phone call, just a little bit of background to understand this process, and then the City of Fort Collins set up a separate phone call with the Marijuana Enforcement Division to be prepared and make sure that we understand their process as well. And then drilling down, once the application was received at the City of Fort Collins, just so you know, TGS applied to the Marijuana Enforcement Division first, and we received that application in 7 days. And right away, the City of Fort Collins started reviewing it and notified the Green Solution that the application was received. And during that time, myself, what I'm doing with my team is I'm reviewing that application in detail, and I'm coming up with a list of questions for the Green Solution as well for the Marijuana Enforcement Division. The packet that the City of Fort Collins received is not fully and complete for a local government. We have our own rules and regulations and application procedure that we need to follow, and then the Marijuana Enforcement Division has a separate procedure that they follow also. And so even though going back to that triangle at the top, the applicant is submitting a twin application, not all the information from the Marijuana Enforcement Division is sent to the local government, which is why the local government or municipality requests supplemental information to support their own application process. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Some other tips, I'm just going to go to the top and talk about, we all know that we have a legislative session, which is intense, and it's always at the start of the year. We are going to be starting that in the next few weeks. And if you're not familiar with it, I really encourage you to follow along. It's from January until May, and know and become very familiar with just following the new legislation process and to see what is going on and what the governor will sign. Once the governor signs the bill, then basically you will be attending rulemaking with the Marijuana Enforcement Division in the fall. I encourage every licensing coordinator or clerk or anyone that's involved with marijuana licensing to attend those processes and reflect back with your team and to make sure that your code is up to speed, and also decide, will your city opt in with new bills if it's applicable. Other tips and tricks that I'm going to point out for your team is timing is everything. I already spoke about that. I'll just recap again. The applicant has to follow a certain timeline with the Marijuana Enforcement Division, and then the local municipality has their own timing on processing applications, but we do have statute to make sure that we follow completing an application in a certain timeline. Loopholes. I put this up here because it's real. They really do exist. There's new processes that are being developed with new marijuana bills. And big tip, be patient and plan for the unexpected. Always have open lines of communication. The Marijuana Enforcement Division and the applicant is there to talk to you and answer questions. So communicate. Collaboration with everyone is key. Just build those relationships with all the agencies in your process. Some challenges. We know that there's lots of challenges still with marijuana legalization. It's still controversial. So the government is dealing with a lot of pressure to get these regulations right. And we have public safety issues, we have tax and banking issues, equity and inclusion. Just know that you're going to have, nothing's going to go right. We're still learning as we go. The toothpaste is out of the tube. It's really hard to put it back, just to give a metaphor. But know that we're here to work together and ask questions. If you don't ask questions, you'll never know. But a process and transparency is key. And I just put this at the end. It's nothing against an applicant, but just don't let the applicant rush you from a municipality, because the local municipality or the local government, we have our own process and we have our own timeline, and we have to report back to our leadership. We have to report back to our city council and make sure that they are up to speed and can understand the process. So I'll close on that I really enjoy the relationship that I have with the Marijuana Enforcement Division, with the Colorado Municipal League, and with our industry folks. Communication is key, and I enjoy what I do. Thanks.
Thank you, T. This is Abby Borchers again with the Green Solution. We wanted to provide sort of a real-world example of one of these first transactions and what we experienced with the cities, our local municipalities, in trying to understand this transaction together and get these change of ownership applications processed. To give some background, the Green Solution is located in 17 cities, and so we have a lot of city partners to work with, and appreciate all those relationships that we've already been able to build with them. And then we are the seller in a transaction involving a publicly traded company. So that's the lens through which I'll be speaking about this transaction on a high level. So I'll start just by talking a little bit about our process. We have established long-standing relationships with the cities that we're located in, and we try to establish those relationships early, even in those cities that we've just opened in. And we prioritized early and frequent communication with the cities and with the Med, and offering to be collaborative and work together through this, because it's new for all of us. And it's a lot of really complex concepts, and really House Bill 1090 sort of turned on its head how we used to think about ownership in the marijuana industry. So we wanted to be as transparent as possible, and so as soon as we knew that this transaction was going to take place, we sent out a press release about the transaction, as well as a personal letter from our president to all of the cities that we're in, just explaining on a high level what the transaction would look like, and explaining that we're still the Green Solution and we're still the business that you know. And then we followed up with every city just to see if they have any questions and talk through the transaction and sort of get familiar on both sides with what our transaction would be, what our process would look like, and what the city's processes would look like, because every city has a different process for a change of ownership. And oftentimes what we found is that
some cities don't have that many licensees. They might not have ever even gone through a change of ownership before. So this is just new for everybody. So after we had those initial conversations, we started to review municipal codes to identify any gating issues for publicly traded companies particularly, but every transaction will have different challenges, I think, in city codes that might need to be updated to match new state rules and state statute regarding ownership. So some challenges that we found in city codes regarding publicly traded companies were some codes still have a requirement for 2 years of Colorado residency for owners of marijuana businesses, which can be challenging when you have a lot of out-of-state owners as part of a publicly traded company or part of any private investment firm or anybody that might be investing. Persons prohibited as licensees is a common section in many municipal codes, and depending on how the language is written, it can require cities to background check every single owner of a marijuana business. For a publicly traded company, that could mean somebody who owns one share of stock, and so obviously that's impossible. So just some city codes need to be updated, and we really wanted to do some proactive issue spotting and make sure that we brought those to the attention of the cities and make sure that we can be helpful in updating those codes. So we took a proactive approach to, suggesting some language changes or offering to be helpful and testify in support of those changes if needed. Some cities are also able to just use discretion and work through their processes, and we were fortunate that the city of Fort Collins was able to sort of decide that they could vet 10% owners, but also owners of 10% or more, but also then update their code to reflect the MED's new rules. Then we began submitting state and local applications, and we really strive to make our state application a comprehensive narrative of the transaction. So there are things that the MED requires on the state application, but rather than just checking off the check boxes, we wanted to make sure that investigators wouldn't have to piece together a bunch of pieces of information to figure out what this transaction was. So outside counsel drafted a cover letter explaining the transaction and going really in detail about what the transaction was, who the CBOs would be, and giving some examples and exhibits. And then we also put together an org chart and tried to make it really, really clear what company was owning which company, who owned the ultimate parent company, just making it super clear for everybody involved so that there doesn't have to be a lot of back and forth, and someone reading the application could hopefully understand the narrative and not have to piece together everything. And then we also put together a process flow chart. So like T was saying, Colorado is a dual licensing system. And so the process flow chart shown here shows the process from submitting to the MED, submitting to the local simultaneously, and then how we ultimately get to a final approval. So we submit to the MED and the local. We submitted to the MED first and then the local, but it can be done simultaneously in most cities. The MED issues their conditional approval of the application that's conditioned on local approval. Then the local jurisdiction issues their approval. Sometimes it's conditional, sometimes it's final. Sometimes if it's conditional, it's conditioned upon final state approval. So once we submit those local approvals to the MED, they can issue their final approval. And then in some cases, we send the final approval to the local jurisdiction so they can do their final approval. So we put together this flow chart and we sent it to any cities that were a little unclear on the process, just so that everybody can be on the same page about what every step looks like. So we just recommend to licensees and to cities to work together to make sure that everybody is crystal clear on every single step in the process and what's required for a complete application. So in our experience, we went through a few pain points or issues that we're still currently working on with many cities. The first and the most major, I would say, is the concept of ownership. House Bill 1090 really changed the way that we all think about ownership in a marijuana business. So it's no longer just vetting every single person who has an equity interest in the license. It's vetting only those people who have 10% or more equity interest in the license, or anybody who controls the business but might not have any ownership at all. And so that sort of affects how cities think about a transfer of ownership versus a change of corporate structure. So this used to be sort of how med applications were structured, in terms of you were either selling your license as a whole, and that was a transfer of ownership. So there would be a new name on the license, a new occupant of your building, or it's a change of corporate structure. So you're adding owners, you're taking away owners, but the person running the business, the actual business itself, is the same. And so that's how we found a lot of local applications were structured. So we sort of had to work through the fact that this is both. Our transaction, and probably many others, are kind of both, where ownership is being transferred to another entity, but it's also a change of corporate structure in terms of adding new controlling beneficial owners who might not have any equity ownership at all. Another kind of point of confusion has been indirect versus direct ownership. So while the green solution, for example, is still the direct owner of the license, we have new indirect owners. So if your parent company changes, the indirect owner of your license has changed, but the person whose name is on the license hasn't changed. And then pre-approval versus post-approval of a change of ownership. So previously, all changes of ownership had to get pre-approved by the Marijuana Enforcement Division and by most cities who require it. And that's also often the case in their municipal code, so it might need to be something that has to be changed. While the publicly traded company transaction itself needs to get pre-approved, as Ross was talking about with the exemptions to a change of ownership application, if there's a change of CBO for a publicly traded company, we only have to apply for a finding of suitability, and in some cases a change of ownership application, within 45 days after the fact. What that means is that the division won't have pre-approval, and the cities also wouldn't have pre-approval. And so some codes need to be updated to reflect that. And then I think a major one that we probably all agree on is the volume of paper and just duplicative documents and just reams of paper for a single application. Sometimes cities are able to just accept a thumb drive with documents on them. Some T has been able to accept submissions via email. So anything we can do to save a few trees is always good. That's really our whole experience so far. We're still working on submitting local applications and changing some ordinances, but we're really thankful to all the cities who've been working with us to get through this together, and we're just going to keep learning together.
All right, this is Dominique Mendiola with the Marijuana Enforcement Division. Our presentation includes contact information in the event you have questions or recommendations. For the Marijuana Enforcement Division, we're including contact information for a couple other members of our team. Rick Haller, agent in charge over the division's Business Licensing and Investigations Unit. This includes initial business applications and changes of ownership. And Sam Quigley, supervisory compliance investigator, overseeing business licensing compliance investigation that includes business renewals, and small changes. We appreciate the opportunity to partner with stakeholders in giving today's presentation. And where Colorado has established a dual licensing framework, this collaboration is really important. If there are recommendations that we develop future presentations or similar resources on other particular areas of statute or rules, for example, the renewal process or licensed premises modifications, please let us know. Finally, I again want to note that the information presented is not legal advice. It is important to refer directly to the relevant statutory provisions, rules, and other requirements at both the state and local level to fully understand requirements that apply to applicants and licensees. Thank you, T, with the City of Fort Collins, and Abby with the Green Solution for joining us, and to the Colorado Municipal League for co-hosting today's presentation.